Great. Woo! Love it. Perfect. Thank you all so much for coming out on this beautiful Tuesday afternoon. We are just racing into summertime here, so I'm really excited to have the rest of May and June to be able to do some really epic programming with you. My name is Sarah Colley. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Great Falls Public Library. I love what I get to do, and I love to be able to work with authors and partners and everybody else alike to be able to bring programming here. So today we have Brenda Wahler here. Brenda was born here in Great Falls, so yay! She is also a fourth generation Montanan. She has studied cantankerous characters from con men to countesses as she digs into deeper stories behind the myths of the American West. A former history and government teacher, she is now an attorney in her day job, as well as an independent historian, freelance writer, and a lifelong horsewoman. She was actually telling me earlier about her 4-H experiences as well here in Great Falls, so lots of fun. Brenda brings a dynamic, tech-savvy, and engaging public speaking style honed by years spent in the classroom and the courtroom. Her newest book, Marcus Daly's Montana Empires, Copper Mining, Racehorses, and Politics. It is for sale over here on the table, that's what that's called, as well as her 2 other earlier books. So we're really excited to be also partnering with Cassiopeia Books, as we usually do, in order to bring the sales straight to you. And with that, I want you to just keep in mind that the restrooms are out in the hallway, and safety things like the stairs are in the back hallway here. And we are excited to have you here, so please join me in welcoming Brenda.
Thank you. Well, what we're doing today is a Great Falls-centric talk about the Copper Kings of Butte. So if anyone was at the History Museum back in March when I did a talk there, this is not the same talk. This will be a totally different, kind of daily adjacent program. So with that, I want to begin with Montana on the cutting edge of then modern technology. So we're going to start our story in 1880. And in 1880, we have copper wire beginning to electrify the United States. And I have a picture of a young Thomas Edison in those years. He patented the electric light bulb in 1879. And with that invention, lights in mines, lights outside, lights in home. It was a revolution more significant probably than anything we're seeing today, even with the internet, even with artificial intelligence. This was the new technology of its time, and everybody wanted to use it. So that would bring us to Butte, Montana. And Butte, Montana began as a failing gold camp, morphed into a fairly successful silver camp, but what they discovered was an abundance of copper, which initially was a problem because it was a waste product. It was they couldn't do anything with it. It was most of the copper in America was being mined in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, a place called the Keweenaw Peninsula. And this copper was what they called native copper. It was very, very pure. It was real easy to refine. And once they got it out of the ground, they could stick it on ships and send it out by water. So it was real easy to get in and out. Butte, not so much. There was copper in Butte, and there was a fairly major strike in 1865, but there was no way to get it anywhere else. The ore was heavy, you had to reduce it down, you had to make it into something that was profitable to ship. But at the time, the only way you could get anywhere in Montana territory was to go up to Fort Benton and take a steamboat, Or you put everything on freight wagons pulled by mules or oxen, and you'd go about 400 miles to the south down to where the Transcontinental Railroad was in Utah. So copper was not a profitable product at that point. Now, what changes is in 1881, the railroad finally gets to Butte, and it was a railroad called the Utah and Northern. With railroad transportation, it begins to be profitable to mine copper. But before you can do it, you've got to get it what they call reduced. And so first what they would do is they put in a thing called a Cornish jig, which was, if you can imagine a jar of water, and you dump some sand into it, and then you shake it, and you know, some stuff settles to the bottom, some stuff floats to the top. That was a way of separating waste rock from copper ore and getting that volume down. Then we had a fellow named Charles Meter, who was very experienced with copper mining. He even had a town called Copperopolis in California. He comes to Butte. He cooks up, literally, this idea of what they called heap roasting. And heap roasting was not the greatest technology, because what they would do is they would put a layer of wood, a layer of ore, a layer of wood, a layer of ore, these big stacks. The biggest ones could cover almost an acre of ground. Then they'd light the wood. And the wood would burn, and as it got down to charcoal, it got hotter and hotter, it would ignite the sulfides in the copper ore, and everything would just spew into the sky, and with the consequences you can well imagine. Choking yellow smoke, the whole town smelled like eggs for weeks on end, and when they lit up the stacks in the winter, and an inversion would roll in into the Summit Valley, trapping the cold air underneath, they said that the carriages would have to put lights on the front in the daytime so they could see each other. It was not the best method for human health, and it only got the copper ore down to roughly, if they were lucky, it got to about 60% purity. And so it still had to be shipped somewhere else to get processed. Now, these are pictures of, this is what copper ore looked like in Butte. The gray one is chalcocite. That was the first stuff they found. That was the most plentiful. That was a sulfide ore. Energite, cobalite, these are other mixes. They had sulfur, they had arsenic, they had all kinds of lovely compounds in there. And the word for ore that's really tough to chemically separate the valuable metal from the junk is refractory. And Butte's copper ore was very, very refractory. Ultimately, only one place in the world could get rid of the arsenic, and that was the refineries in Swansea, Wales. So they would reduce this ore as much as they could, then they put it on the railroad, they'd send it east or down to the Gulf, they'd put it on ships, and it would be ballast in the ships, send it overseas, and finally have it refined into the very, very pure form that could be made into copper wire, which then came back to America and lit up the whole East Coast. So, this is obviously a problem for Butte, and they're not going to make the big bucks unless they can figure out a way to send pure, more concentrated ore. Ultimately, it takes a very long time before they don't have to go to Swansea, but for decades, this was the technique. Now, enter Marcus Daly. He came to Butte in 1876. He was working for some Salt Lake City merchants and bankers known as the Walker Brothers. They bought some silver mines in Butte. He ran their silver mining operation, and he noticed there was a whole lot of copper in Butte. And he understood the economics of copper, and he understood technology, and he knew if he could just figure out how to get copper from Butte to some place that could make use of it, there was money to be made. And so he buys some of his own claims, one of which was the Anaconda mine in Butte, where he was mining silver at first, and he brought in business partners, some folks, George Hearst, who was the father of William Randolph Hearst, James Benally Hagan, who became his close friend and most trusted associate, and Lloyd Tevis, who was, among other things, president of Wells Fargo. These gentlemen helped Daly get the capital to develop the Anaconda mine, and about 300 feet down, he hits chalcocite. And so he knows he's got very, very rich copper. So then in 1882, he goes to his partners and says, we need to bring that technology of Europe to America. We need to build a great smelter. Well, he can't do it all right away because, for one thing, in Europe they keep a pretty tight lid on the tech, as we would see even today. Nobody wants to share their AI models. Everybody's, fighting over coders. Same thing back then. They didn't want to have that process widely known, so they were kind of making it up as they went. What Daly did is he looked for a site close enough to Butte where he could build a smelter, but he had plenty of room, plenty of water, plenty of land, and he could do it his way. This becomes the town of Anaconda. And by 1886, his first smelter had already fired up. Became known as the Upper Works, because then he built another smelter that was called the Lower Works, and then he built a third smelter called the Washoe Reduction Works, which is where the big stack is in Anaconda today. But this is a photo from 1886, and you can see that he went from this little tent camp where he started, fires up the Upper Works in 1884, and by 1886, you can see all the houses. And the best part for Daly is over here in the upper corner, the upper right, you see all that smoke blowing away from the town. No heat roasting. Now, that smoke from the smelters that Daly built in Anaconda later caused some significant problems when we get into the early 1900s. And if you're looking for additional books from the library, there's one called Smoke Wars that discusses how things didn't quite work out as well as Daly might have hoped. But at least no one was choking on the smoke, no one was dying, and he had a model city that he made into a showplace. He ultimately, by 1894, he even puts in Anaconda as a nominee to become the capital of Montana. And that's a discussion. It became quite a political hot potato that I talk about in my book, and I won't talk about it here today. But this was the dream that Daly had, was a model city with state-of-the-art technology. But he still has a choke point. How do you get the copper ore from Butte to the town of Anaconda, and the finished reduced ore, which is getting into the 60 to 70% range? It's getting to be more and more profitable, but you still have to get it out. And you have to get it to the East Coast, and he still has to ship some of it even to Swansea. There's smaller smelters in Baltimore and some other places like that, but he's got himself a transportation choke point. The Utah Northern Railroad goes to Butte, and then it built a branch out to Garrison, Montana, which is, I want to say west of Deer Lodge. It's actually kind of north, it's on I-90. They built a spur into Anaconda, but it's a narrow gauge, slow railroad, and it's got to go clear down to Utah before it can hit the transcontinental line. So, competition arrives in the form of the Northern Pacific. And this is a mural in our state capitol in Helena that is the stylized version of the last spike ceremony that made the Northern Pacific a transcontinental line. And so now the Northern Pacific is pretty happy because They hook up to the Utah Northern Line at, that's why we call it, used to be called Garrison Junction there, where US 12 meets I-90. And it was named, by the way, total trivia point, Garrison, Montana was named for William Lloyd Garrison, who happened to be the president of the Northern Pacific's father-in-law. But there was trouble in paradise. The president of the Northern Pacific was Henry Villard. And he, instead of competing with the Utah Northern, which was by that time owned by the Northern Pacific, and if we start talking about mergers and acquisitions and high finance, this was the Gilded Age of America. And in the Gilded Age, there were also mergers and acquisitions and insider trading and business collusion and all the scandals you could ever hope to see, and unfortunately history seems to echo. Things did not end well in the Gilded Age. But at the time, the Northern Pacific and the Union Pacific were rivals in most situations, except in Montana. In Montana, they realized that they could work together to improve the spur from Garrison to Butte. And they colluded to jack up the freight rates and make it very, very expensive for Marcus Daly and the Anaconda Company to get his ore anywhere. And so he wants some competition. And this will bring us into the orbit of Great Falls history. There was a railroad called the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba, the SPM&M. It was operated, primarily owned by a gentleman by the name of James J. Hill out of Minneapolis, St. Paul. Hill was also a rival of the Northern Pacific, but he had no interest in collusion. He wanted to build his own railroad empire. And of course, we now call the passenger rail that runs through northern Montana the Empire Builder for a very good reason. And Hill County, absolutely. Incidentally, another trivia departure. The town of Havre was originally a settlement called Bullhook Bottoms. People don't know that, but it was Hill who wanted it to get a more sophisticated name, and hence Havre. And they say that they either spun a globe and stuck a finger on it, or they threw darts in a map. There's a number of highline towns with surprisingly European names, and that was partly because Hill was wanting things to get classed up a little bit. So Hill was very good friends with a gentleman by the name of Paris Gibson. And Paris Gibson was out here looking at the falls and having dreams of hydropower, of the things that you could do by harnessing the Missouri, by harnessing the Great Falls of the Missouri. Now, he was a sheep guy, so he was thinking in terms of woolen mills and things like that, but he talked with James J. Hill and said, if you can just get the railroad out here, it's profitable. And Hill agreed. He comes out to Montana in 1884 and meets with Gibson and sees this area and is very, very impressed by it. He buys into the Great Falls Townsite Company. But the thing that I learned as I was doing research on Marcus Daly is that Hill was already thinking about the mines of Butte. And what he did is he wasn't about to take any kind of a jaunt on the Northern Pacific, because of course that's his rival. And the Northern Pacific did come up to Helena and then over to Garrison and down. No, Hill gets on a stagecoach and takes a stagecoach down to Butte. And in July of 1884, he sneaks into town and meets up with Marcus Daly. And Marcus Daly, in the middle of the night, takes him into the mines. Because now, of course, they had electricity, so they could light them up. And he shows Hill the vast works of the mines of Butte, of the underground world that was being developed there. And so Hill sneaks back to Great Falls the next day. Northern Pacific is none the wiser. And before you know it, he's lobbying Congress for a right-of-way across northern Montana. And so Northern Pacific finally gets wind that Hill is coming into Montana, and they're like, hey, wait a minute, we had a deal. You weren't going to come into Montana, and we weren't going to be messing around with Iowa and Minnesota and eastern Dakotas. And of course, that was one of those deals that was never really a deal in the first place. It was just kind of a holding pattern to keep them out of each other's hair for a while. The Northern Pacific throws a fit, slows it down, but finally Hill gets the right-of-way approved, and in 1887, he begins to lay rail from Lynott, North Dakota, into Montana, as far as Havre. By the end of 1887, he's to Havre, he drops down to Great Falls, and by the end of the year, he's in Helena, which is where the Northern Pacific line met up. The following year, in 1888, he did the more difficult part of construction, and he got the railroad over the mountains and through the canyons into Butte. And so, with that, by 1888, the Butte Hill no longer has to suffer a rail monopoly. These two maps show you how this all came together. This is the Great Northern Line, and you can see the dark line running across the High Line. You see the dark line coming down through Great Falls, through Helena, and ending in Butte City, Montana Territory. At the same time, the east line that you see going across the Continental Divide and heading into the Idaho Panhandle, that is worked on in 1889 until they finally get to Washington State in 1893, and they finish the Great Northern as a transcontinental line. He didn't try to build from both coasts to the middle the way that the Northern Pacific did, or the way the Union Pacific and Central Pacific. He just went east to west. This map, the lower map, is the Northern Pacific. And the Northern Pacific, you can see the dark line following basically the Yellowstone River. He builds a branch line down to Yellowstone Park. That was the big Northern Pacific passenger rail draw. And you see these little hooks in the middle. This one went to Butte. No, I'm sorry, this one went to, of all places, Wicks. This is Helena right here. This went down to a little silver camp called Wicks, Montana, which is about 20 miles outside of Helena. And then this is the line. This is Garrison Junction right here. And this line went down through Deer Lodge to a stop that was called Stewart. This branch went to Anaconda. This branch went to Butte. This was the Montana Union line. And so that was the choke point that was giving Daly fits. Because even with the Great Northern having its Montana Central line down to Butte, there still was that Union Pacific, Northern Pacific choke point from Butte to Anaconda. And so he had to get the ore to Butte, and then he had to get the refined copper out of Anaconda to the rest of the world. How was he going to do it? Well, the Northern Pacific went too far. The Montana Union line jacked up the prices for everything, and they thought they had Daly over a barrel. Daly, however, had his backers. Hearst, Hagen, Tevis, those fellows. Well, James Ben Ali Hagen was a gambler. He had race horses, he had a plunger's instinct, and he just said, don't worry about it, do what you gotta do. The mines of Butte, all of the Anaconda smelters, Daly shut it all down in 1891. And the Montana Union, Anaconda was really their only customer. And so he keeps the mines shut down until, I think he shut them down in March, he keeps them shut down until October, until the Montana Union cried uncle, rolled back the rate increases, and agreed to, play a little more nicely. However, Daly realizes that he's had it with the Northern Pacific. And once again, he approaches James J. Hill. And he has a dream of a railroad of his very own that came to be known as the Butte, Anaconda, and Pacific. And so this is actually the passenger train, one of the passenger trains of Butte, Anaconda, Pacific going through, I think, Silver Canyon. Hill underwrites the construction of the Butte, Anaconda, and Pacific. Now, over time, a separate entity, pays off what Hill invested in, so Hill winds up not being in it. I think he still had some financial stake, but he was not the owner of it. But this connected Anaconda to Butte, and then to the Montana Central line of the Great Northern. So it brings competition in. People say, what about the Pacific? I got the Butte and the Anaconda part, what about the Pacific? Well, Daly played with the idea that he would take the Butte, Anaconda, and Pacific farther west. And if anybody's driven around Georgetown Lake or that area, that Piltler Scenic Route, he had the idea that he could take the railroad over the hill, over the mountains to Phillipsburg, then overscout the whole pass to the Bitterroot, where he had a big ranch and he had a horse ranch, and he also had a lot of timber interests. He could pick up lumber there. And then he had the idea that he'd run it north along the Bitterroot, up the Flathead, and connect it to the Great Northern Line at Kalispell. Now, when you look at it on a map, that just doesn't work. It was a nice idea, but if you imagine, his idea would have been a little bit crazy. He would have taken from Anaconda over to Phillipsburg, over to the Bitterroot River, up kind of through Missoula, roughly about Highway 93, and then there's Kalispell up in northwestern Montana. So obviously that was, one of those best laid plans that people later said, no, let's just not say we did. So the next group of people, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. The next group of copper kings in Butte. Now we talk about William Andrews Clark, who was Daly's great rival in Butte, but Clark was more the competition to Daly for political power and influence. Clark was not as involved in all of these high finance shenanigans. He just kept building mines, building small smelters to take care of his own product in-house, and slowly became the single richest individual mine owner in Butte. He was a happy boy as far as that went, but there were some other players, and this was the Lewison brothers. You had Adolph and Leonard. They were out of New York. They were merchants and bankers. They paired up with Charles Meader. Remember, we had a slide about him earlier in this talk. Well, along with Charles Meader, they were sort of the third big power on the Butte Hill. In 1887, they roll all of their interests into what became known as the Boston and Montana Company. They also had a subsidiary, what became a subsidiary called the Butte and Boston. It's again, very complicated corporate financial shenanigans with the Lewisons, but essentially, they wanted to develop copper at a level comparable to that of the Anaconda Company. Why Boston if they lived in New York? Well, they had another partner, A.S. Bigelow. He was the guy from Boston. Meader was ready to retire. They bought him out. And from there, they decide that they want to build a smelter. Now, they had some involvement with Hill and the Montana Central. And I have not had, because my research primarily focused on Marcus Daly, and I know in Great Falls history, they talk about the Lewisons encouraging Hill to bring the Montana Central line down to Butte. But that was, they formed the Boston, Montana in 1887. Remember that Hill gets the Montana Central to Butte in 1888, but they had actually been working on that line since 1886, and so it's very complicated. I think that Daly had almost a bigger role than the Lewisons, although the Lewisons definitely helped. They had their local guy, Thomas Couch, and of course he's pretty famous in Great Falls because he was the man on the ground. The Lewisons never lived in Montana. They stayed back east, but Thomas Couch was their local man, just like Marcus Daly had been the superintendent for the Walker brothers, and then when he bought the Anaconda, and sold 75% of it to Hearst, Hagen and Tevis. He only kept 25%. He again defined himself as a superintendent of the Anaconda properties, and that meant that these were the guys who were actually making all the decisions on the ground. Couch knew that the Boston and Montana needed a better smelter, and he starts looking around at where to do it. The Boston and Montana was actually, because of the connection from Charles Meader, Couch was kind of the king of the heap roasting in Butte. He knew it was a problem, and he bought Robert Vaughn's ranch in Sun River in 1889, moved his family up here. He didn't want to live in the smoky city of Butte. Certainly didn't want his wife and kids to. So he knew this was a problem. And the little smelter they had, which was Charles Meader's Bell smelter, it couldn't process everything they were pulling out of the ground. So if he was going to compete with the Anaconda Company, he starts talking to James J. Hill and Paris Gibson. And they start talking about hydropower. And this is a later photograph of the early Boston and Montana smelter and Black Eagle Dam. So here's what happened. The Lewisons were from Germany originally, and they knew that the Germans were the only people that could really compete with Swansea. There had been copper mined in Germany since the Middle Ages. They also could remove arsenic and all the other impurities from the ores of the Butte Hill. And they went over to Germany to study the technology that was there. And they learned there was this process that was called an electrolytic process of removing the last contaminants from copper to render it pure enough to make into things like wire to generate all that electricity. Oops, I'm going to quit waving around my, I'm sorry here. There. I need to quit waving my remote. The technology they learned about in Germany, they first applied it to a small smelter that they built on the East Coast in Rhode Island. Then they built another one in New Jersey, a place called Perth Amboy, and there still was later a very major smelting facility owned by the Anaconda Company back east. Then they take what they learned and they said, okay, let's bring it to Montana. They looked at Helena, they looked at Great Falls. One of the things you need to build a smelter is lots and lots of water, because it's used in processing, it was used for steam power, it was used for everything. The city of Anaconda had been built because Warm Springs Creek had enough water. Well, they take a look at Helena. The water in Helena, of course, is on the Missouri, which was a ways from town, so that wasn't exactly the ideal situation for them. Plus, there's all those canyons over there. We think about Hauser Dam, Holter Dam, Gates of the Mountains. That's a canyony place. So he's looking at Great Falls, and of course, at this point, Hill talks to the Lewisons and says, well, among other things I can do for you is give you 1,500 shares of Townsite Company that he had some control over. They had the Great Falls Water and Power Company. They signed a contract with the Boston and Montana in 1889. And this is the year that the ground breaks for Black Eagle Dam, which is finished in 1891. At the same time, the Boston and Montana starts building their refinery on what later became known as Smelter Hill. They have it operational by 1892, powered by the hydro from Black Eagle Dam. There's also a virtually endless supply of water from the Missouri. And the Boston and Montana pioneers electrolytic processing in Montana. So they leapfrog over the Anaconda Company, which is still the biggest dog on the block in processing more copper than anyone else. But the Boston and Montana makes this huge technological leap forward. Meanwhile, again, this part of the country also had rich coal reserves. And if there's one thing that will not run on hydropower, it would be a railroad. So our friend James J. Hill, he needed coal. And he started buying up claims around what became Sand Coulee, huge coal deposits there. Daly also needed coal. Warm Springs Creek over there by Anaconda wasn't set up for hydropower generation. It's not the right, just doesn't fall the right way. So he's also looking for coal reserves, and he notices belt. So named for the belt of copper that you could see back in the day in some of the geologic formations there. And so Daly's already mining coal in belt by 1892. Hill has consolidated his coal interests at Sand Coulee by 1896. And so this whole part of Montana becomes critical to the processing and development of copper from Butte, Montana. Now, also, of course, Hill builds branch lines, Nyhart, Bell, Sand Coulee, and all of these connections further cement that close relationship between Hill and Marcus Daly. And Daly, of course, has now any number of connections to northern Montana because of the railroad and coal interests. So Boston and Montana, they're playing, big corporate games. Anaconda Company is playing big corporate games. And then there's the problem child. Frederick Augustus Heinze. He didn't like to be called by his nickname Fritz, and so everyone in Butte liked to call him Fritz. He arrives in Butte in 1889, a 19-year-old with a fresh engineering degree, which he'd trained in Germany, by the way, gets a job with the Boston and Montana. Now, by the time the Boston and Montana is developing Great Falls, they create a vacuum for ore processing in Butte. And so Heinze takes his knowledge and he builds a brand new smelter. He gets rid of there's going to be no heat roasting, gets rid of the Bell smelter. He builds a very small but state-of-the-art smelter right in Butte. And he processes all the ore for all the little guys that are around in Butte that aren't part of Anaconda or part of the Boston and Montana. He's their hero. They think, oh man, Fritz is just the greatest guy. He also, in modern terms, we would say he was a party animal. He drank, he ran around with women, he gambled, he lived large. And he also played hardball. He bought a mine called the Raris, and by 1895 he was dropping the shafts and he was nibbling into the mines of Boston and Montana. They figured that out and they sued him. So he fights back. Discovers that what they called courthouse mining was perhaps more profitable than the real thing. He discovered something known as the apex theory. And the apex law in the United States held that if a mineral vein came to the surface, if it apexed on your claim, you could dig and follow that vein anywhere it went, over the meadow, through the woods, underground, no matter if you went into other people's claims, ground or not. Well, so that was the way it worked legally. Now, geologically, it makes no sense at all, because underground mineral veins aren't like blood vessels that one flows to the other and they're all connected. Underground mineral veins formed millions of years ago. Between then and now, there were earthquakes, there's fault lines, there's just things, if you ever try to freeze ice cubes, things crack, things do strange motions. And so, of course, there's no such thing as following a vein anywhere it goes, because it'll dead end, and then you have to go this way and that way and hope you hook up with something again. And so, but he files these lawsuits and says, well, my rarest mine, the Boston and Montana properties, mine, all their claims, well, the apex on my claim, it's my copper ore. And the lawsuits become so extensive. This is a model that was, it's at Montana Tech in one of the classroom buildings right now. This photograph up here is a photo of the Butte Hill. And all these little lines are showing you where the various mine shafts were. This is what it looked like underground, based on the mines that they had at the time. And they built these 3D models as part of the lawsuits to demonstrate to the courts, here's where the copper went, here's where this vein went, here's where that vein went, here's the shafts going down. And as you can see, it's not a smooth process by any stretch of the imagination. Then, Heinze pulls the biggest scam of all. He discovered, through a careful search of land records, that amongst the Anaconda St. Lawrence claims on the Butte Hill was a little patch of land, 2 patches of land, maybe the size of this room we're standing in right now, and he claimed them. One of them he called it the Copper Trust, which was kind of a little tongue-in-cheek name. And what did he do? He claimed that the entire Anaconda St. Lawrence vein system apexed on his little claim. And so that's what you call bearding the lion. He successfully convinced the courts to put the Boston and Montana mines into a receivership until somebody could figure out who owned it. And so they were all kind of locked up financially. But when he takes on the Anaconda, Daly is obviously a very unhappy man, and he starts playing hardball. They began to say that to a trust it must become, and this is the Gilded Age, when you had a steel trust, you had the Standard Oil Trust, you had the idea that a whole industry could come under the control of one gigantic corporate entity. And this gentleman by the name of Thomas Lawson was a Boston stockbroker. He meets up with a fellow by the name of Henry Huddleston Rogers, who was one of the directors and the leader of the Standard Oil Trust. And they cook up the idea that they could create a copper trust. And so they built this little shell company called Amalgamated, has no property yet. Lawson's from Boston, he's the most familiar with the Boston and Montana Company. He wants to buy the Boston and Montana, but he can't get it because, well, he doesn't want to get it because this receivership has everything in a mess. There's too many lawsuits. So while he's trying to figure that out, Henry Rogers, who is a little more aggressive, makes his own plans. He goes to Butte. Now, technically, he went on vacation in Montana. Why? He and 4 of his friends, one of whom was his lawyer, one of whom was a banker, and one of whom was an engineer, just his best friends in the world. Oh, they're touring Yellowstone Park. Just a pleasure trip. Oh, you know, let's swing by Butte for the heck of it, you know, good bars, good time had by all. And then there's this guy named Marcus Daly, he's pretty friendly, you know, he'll party with you. And so Henry Rogers meets up with Marcus Daly in 1898. And this is probably when they hatched the plan to make the Anaconda Company the core of the Amalgamated Copper Trust. So in 1899, the Anaconda Company is sold to Amalgamated. Daly becomes the president of the company, chairman of the board, all these huge important things he tried to avoid most of his life. Hagen retired, Hearst and Tennis were dead, and all of a sudden, Henry Rogers and the other big players in the Standard Oil Trust have control of Butte's copper. Now, people were mad at Daly. He's betrayed us, he's horrible, he's awful, he's terrible. But the truth is he was dying. He was only 58 when he died. It was what they called Bright's disease. And Bright's disease is, when you look at the symptoms, one of the conditions that the symptoms describe is type 2 diabetes. And in those days, there was no insulin. And Bright's disease was basically, it was a combination of kidney failure and heart failure. And he dies in November of 1900. Rogers is the vice president, the treasurer. They didn't want to use John Rockefeller's brother William had been a big player in Standard Oil. They didn't want him to be a corporate officer of Amalgamated because that would make it look too much like Standard Oil was running everything. So they tapped William's son, so you have William G and William A, and this confuses the daylights out of everybody. But basically, they come up with this corporate structure for what becomes known as the crime of Amalgamated. They bought Anaconda for about $39 million. They capitalized the stock at $75 million. It was a feeding frenzy. These guys made bank, and ultimately, when that stock price could not sustain itself and it crashed, Thomas Lawson turned on Rogers and wrote a book called Frenzied Finance, The Crime of Amalgamated, and did this huge expose on how it all happened. Fascinating book. You may have it in your rare books collection. It's worth looking for, Lawson. So it's a fascinating read if you want to see how the Gilded Age does not go well for ordinary people. Meanwhile, remember Heinze? Well, he keeps filing apex lawsuits, and Daly's death makes very little difference to him. He just takes on Amalgamated because he's got more courage than brains. Actually, he's brilliant, but not strategically so. Ultimately, he bought the judges in Butte so that every time a lawsuit came into court, the judges would rule in his favor, and particularly one named William Clancy, who was a chronic alcoholic, among other things, single guy, rather slovenly in his habits. The company, now Amalgamated Copper, wants to get rid of Heinze somehow. And the thing they think will happen is that they could just start winning in court. So they want to get what they call the change of venue law. When you think the judge is biased, you can move it to a different court. Well, legislature doesn't want to do that because they don't really like Amalgamated all that much. So they shut down the mines in 1903. Marcus Daly is dead. The copper collar is tightening on Butte. Corporate ownership is controlling everything. There's a couple of local guys. John Ryan is now the president of the Anaconda series of mines. And they shut down the mines, and they shut down the smelters until the legislature goes into special session and passes the change of venue law. And then they start winning some lawsuits. At that point, Heinze realizes he better cut and run. They cash him out fairly generously. He takes his winnings, goes to the East Coast, teams up with his brothers, and they start trying to cook up another copper trust to compete with Amalgamated. In the process, they almost crashed the financial system of the United States in the Panic of 1907. Believe it or not, this was, yes, Montana boys. They caused this trouble. And after J.P. Morgan had to bail out the federal government to keep the whole system from collapsing, people started saying, you know, we maybe should come up with this thing, and it eventually led to what was known as the Federal Reserve. Thanks to Frederick Augustus Heinze. This mural is in the Butte Courthouse and kind of sums up his character. You got the smoking, the gambling, and the drinking, and he dies of cirrhosis of the liver at the age of 45 in 1914. So, now, as Great Falls becomes part of the Anaconda beer, of the Amalgamated beer, Thomas Couch, he kind of retired to go to his ranch in 1896. As Lawson and Rogers are working to form Amalgamated, they also negotiate with the Lewisons to form what later became known as ASARCO, American Smelting and Refining Company. And I have not drilled down into this as deeply as I could because most of my research ended with Daly's death in 1900. But basically, Amalgamated's already kind of putting some tentacles into the Boston and Montana smelter. They buy out the mines in Butte quite early on because, again, the apex lawsuits, the receiverships, all that stuff, the only way that Butte is going to function was pretty much one company controlling all the copper on the Butte Hill. Couch and Leonard Lewison both died in 1902. Adolph Lewison is mostly happy to sit back and collect the checks. Ultimately, Amalgamated Copper takes control of the Boston, Montana smelter here in Great Falls by 1906, and they begin to build the big stack in 1908. Now, and so, with that, I'm done with my talk, and I can open up the floor to question and answer. And also, I just want to point out that, like we said at the beginning, Marcus Daly's Montana Empires is for sale today, as well as my older books. Marcus Daly's Road to Montana covers his life from his birth in Ireland in 1841 to the decision to build the Anaconda smelter in 1882. And Montana Empires takes him from 1882 through the rest of his life with a short epilogue that kind of tells you what happened to everybody else. I also want to mention my first book was Montana Horse Racing, A History. Has an entire chapter just on horse racing in Great Falls, so if there's any people who are fans of the horse racing world, I have a whole history of that as well. So, any questions? Give everybody some time to think.
Good question.
Yeah.
Towards the end of his life, Mark Daly was getting into investing in sugar beets. What do you know about that?
Not much. You know, he began to buy some coal properties down by Red Lodge. He allied with the Northern Pacific, even though he didn't like them. He allied with them to build a railroad down to Red Lodge to access more coal than he could get in Belt. I'm not entirely certain where his sugar beet investments were in eastern Montana, but that would have been fairly late in his life.
Yeah, it was actually in Hamilton. They have the stack there. There was going to, both him and Clark were going to start in it. It's kind of interesting. Like if he hadn't died, it could have been the next thing. Like he would have invested in the sugar.
I really didn't come across anything on sugar beets in Hamilton. I mean, I know that his big interest in Hamilton was timber, and he built that big mill there. I know that there is that one great big stack out there on the edge of Hamilton, and so they also had on his estate, on his Bitterroot stock farm, besides raising racehorses, he also had extensive apple orchards. And after his death, there was a huge apple boom in the Bitterroot, and that was another piece of it. So, yeah, I'm not that familiar with what the sugar beet industry was like there. I know he was also the big investor over there in the irrigation system. So, yeah, I honestly don't know. I didn't run across enough about that to tweak my radar. So, thank you for sharing that. That's great. Other questions? I'll go to you then.
I was just going to ask what the most surprising thing was for you
About
your research into this particular book.
I think the biggest thing is that Montana was on the cutting edge of technology. Anaconda Copper was, Butte Copper was Silicon Valley. The Anaconda smelter and then the Boston and Montana smelters, they were trying to electrify the entire United States. They say that if you took all of the copper that came out of the Butte Hill and you poured it in one sheet, it would cover I-15 from Butte to Salt Lake City, 4 inches thick. So that's, I mean, we are now replacing copper with fiber optic cable, and some of that copper that was first laid down came from the Butte Hill, all over the United States.
Butte had electricity before New York City.
We were, they had a brush dynamo lighting up the Alice mine in 1881. Edison rang in the new year from 1879 to 1880 with demonstrating the light bulb that he had patented. And yeah, you're right, we were quicker out here. In fact, to this day, I have friends, when I graduated from law school, I had friends who went to Washington, D.C. and worked for the tax court, some other places back there, and they were saying the internet in Washington, D.C. is not as good as our internet was at the University of Montana School of Law, the Alexander Blewett School of Law now we call it. Yeah, we've actually been a little bit ahead for more than anyone realizes. It's not just cowboys and that sort of stuff. We've actually been a very sophisticated place, and you know that here in Great Falls. I mean, this is where folks like Ken Robinson have been writing about how important it was that we're not the backwater, that we had fashion within a few months of it being in Paris and New York. We had technology, like you say, sometimes ahead of the East Coast. You have a question?
Yeah, I was just curious about, did Daly know that the people who were approaching him to set up the Amalgamated Copper Trust were from Standard Oil?
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
did he know that Rockefeller was behind that
Oh,
whole
yeah.
thing?
Yeah, and one of the things that I tell people is that you don't want to go down the Rockefeller rabbit trail too bad, because by the time you get to the 1890s, John Rockefeller was kind of retiring, and he was not terribly happy with his brother William or with Henry Rogers. They were kind of the new young bloods, and their tactics and their techniques were not as honest. I think, John Rockefeller was a huge player in the Gilded Age, and he was certainly not an angel of light in every way, but if you were going to compare, say, Steve Jobs to Elon Musk, you kind of had that same dynamic going on, that the new guys were just, like I say, what they did just by taking the stock, pumping it up, watering it down, and then walking away laughing all the way to the bank. They were a new breed. It was an interesting set of characteristics. Any other questions?
Did Daly have any business with Carnegie at all?
I don't know if he directly did. In Anaconda, the library there wasn't a Carnegie library like we had here, originally had here. It was the Hearst Free Library, was funded by Phoebe Hearst, George Hearst's widow. And so, these guys all knew each other, but Daly's business connections, this is why I talked about copper mining, horse racing, and politics, because most of Daly's business associates, you can track to the guys that were into thoroughbreds. August Belmont was for a while an officer of the Anaconda Company when they did a reorganization. He sells some of his horses to W.C. Whitney. All of these, those were kind of the people that he ran with. His wife, Daly's wife, spent much of the year in New York City. She got pretty close with the Vanderbilts. Those were kind of the people. So there was a lot of competition. The robber barons were not always all colluding with each other. They were fighting with each other as well. So, yeah. Other questions? Yes?
What do you know about the Daly's mansion in New York and where he lived there?
Oh, that's a fun story. Daly actually, he spent most of his time in New York at this place called the Hotel Netherland. That was his headquarters. But his wife, as their children were becoming young adults, and especially the daughters, she wanted a proper home, and so she leased a townhouse from William Waldorf Astor. And I think around 1898 is when that lease went through. Now, in the meantime, William Andrews Clark builds this monstrosity of a mansion on Fifth Avenue that was considered, even by the standards of the Gilded Age, it was considered over the top. And there's a whole book about his youngest daughter, Eugette Clark, and that whole world. But that mansion was such a heap that when he died, nobody could afford to keep it up, and they actually tore it down in 1924. But Daly, the Daly home, if you took out your phones, you Google its address, was 725 Fifth Avenue. And that little 6-story townhouse didn't survive very long. It got torn down and replaced by a department store called the Von Teller Department Store. And you know what's about to happen. It gets purchased by a gentleman by the name of Donald Trump. And so now, if you Google 725 Fifth Avenue, you will find that that is the street address for Trump Tower. And so that's the rest of that story. And I suspect you knew that.
I was just curious whether you knew that.
Yeah, that was, you can't make this stuff up, folks. You just can't. You just can't. So, and the irony. Any other questions?
I'd just like to make a comment. You saw Fritz's connection to the Federal Reserve, which is so in our news today. And the thing about the immigrants who came to Montana, not only the miners, I'm second generation from the coal miners who came to San Cooley, who mined the coal to run the smelter, to make the copper wire that electrified the country. And the death rate of those immigrants working and providing this for these rich guys was atrocious.
We didn't, I think it's interesting when we look at, I think in another week you guys are having the Montana Constitution Roadshow come here. Thursday, oh, okay, 2 days from now, excellent. One of the things in our 1972 Constitution is the concept of workers' compensation system. And those were the abuses that workers' comp was designed to mitigate. I think that what's interesting is that Marcus Daly actually cared about his workers. He doesn't get good press because after he died, between Heinze and William Andrews Clark and the amalgamated copper collar that tightened over the state of Montana, they blamed him for all that was evil in the world. But the truth is that he was an old-time boss Irishman, and he believed, noblesse oblige, you look out for the people underneath you. He himself had worked in the silver mines of the Comstock. He had grown up poor. He survived the Great Famine in Ireland. He never forgot where he came from. And even when he had to shut down the mines and have layoffs, he would say, this is causing me pain. I wish I didn't have to do it. When there was a financial crisis in 1893, Panic of 1893, he pushes back against Hagen, who says, well, you got to do some layoffs, cut wages. He says, no, I'm not. There's already 2,000 unemployed men in Butte from the other mines. I'm going to have riots. I'm not going to do it. So he cared about the people who were under him. Now, was he completely philanthropic in every way? No. He was trying to make a buck just like everybody else. But compared to what came after him, he was paying attention. During the time he ran the Alice Silver Company, they began the process of actually, they built a hospital for their workers. You got hurt, you could go get medical care right there on site. And Daly's widow in Hamilton ultimately builds the Marcus Daly Memorial Hospital in Hamilton, Montana. So, and Daly, back through part of his career, and I've discussed this in Road to Montana, as he moved up in the world, he went from the mines of the Comstock in Nevada to the mines in Utah of silver mining there, became a superintendent for the Walker Brothers down in Utah. He brought in, he allied with the first Catholic bishop of Salt Lake City to bring in Sisters of the Holy Cross to build a hospital in Salt Lake City that became the core of what is now the Utah Regional Medical Center. So this interest in medicine and caring for injured workers was something that actually mattered to him, at least, as long as it didn't interfere too much with making profit. I'm not going to put a halo on his head. He was not a perfect person, but yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. And of course, Hill in San Cooley was not as generous in his company towns as was Daly with Anaconda, Hamilton, and Belt. I think that there was. Hill was a little bit more, let's just get a profit going here, one way or the other. Yes?
How much time did he put into racehorsing?
As much as he could, but of course the busier he got, I would say it was more money than time. There was an estimate that he spent $1 million on racehorses. I think it was way more than that. I think that's the low end. He had roughly 22,000 acres in the Bitterroot. If you drive down Highway 93, or you take that cut off to the East Side Highway around Corvallis, he pretty much owned almost everything from just south of Corvallis all the way through Hamilton down to a little place called Grantville. And east to the foot of Bitterroot, west to the Sapphires. You can see these maps, they're huge properties. And so the horse racing, he had about 1,200 horses in the Bitterroot. And he loved it. That was, I tell people, if you've ever, speaking of George Hearst and William Randolph Hearst, we've all remember the old classic movie Citizen Kane. I maintained the horses for Daly, that was Rosebud. That was, spoiler guys, if you haven't seen the movie. But I mean, I think that's where his heart was. And he, couldn't probably spend as much time hands-on, but he hired truly top-notch people, both training in the East and now like Sam Lucas, who managed the thoroughbreds in Hamilton. Yeah, and
So my grandfather came from Coastville, Iowa, out to Montana in 1895, thinking he was going to work in the Butte mines, and was recruited and was a jockey because he was just the right size. So that was the adventure and thrill of his life. And then he went to work for the railroad after Daly died and worked in Butte and then later in Billings for his career. But our family then followed the Triple Crown all of our lives, and I've never been to a horse race, but those are the stories that I grew up with. And so that Marcus Daly was a real hero in my grandfather and in my family's start in Montana, that he took care of his jockeys, and that he loved his horses, but I just didn't know how much time. And I didn't realize that he died so soon, but that now gives me some understanding of some of the intersections of the other opportunities that my grandfather took. It makes me want to look into our family history.
absolutely. Well, what's really interesting about Daly and the horse racing is that when he built Anaconda, by 1888, he had a track called the Anaconda Driving Park, state-of-the-art, beautiful place, could hold about 2,000 people. He also, by 1896, he bought the Butte racetrack and built another huge grandstand there. And from about 1896 till they banned horse racing in the Progressive era after his death, they ran a meet in Butte for 60 days and meet in Anaconda for another 30. People could come from Chicago and California and all over the country out here to Montana, run all summer and make more money out here than they could in the East or the West Coast. And so these, Daly, with his own horses, he kind of test drove them a little bit out here before he took the best to the tracks in the East. And it's kind of like the first tier went east, the second tier went to California, and then, yeah. So,
And the California is where my grandfather got to go. He went to watch and learn east, but he got to participate in California.
And I have a whole talk on horse racing in Butte I do sometimes, but I like to point out that if you've ever heard of Seabiscuit, his jockey Red Pollard got a start in Butte. And Pollard's good buddy, a guy named George Wolfe, who was in the Hall of Fame, and if you saw the horse racing, the Seabiscuit movie, they do a lot with Wolfe as well. Wolfe grew up in Babb, learned to ride racehorses by doing Indian relay up on the Blackfeet Res, and ultimately also winds up going to Mexico and then to California. He rides Seabiscuit in his famous match race, but also was a major Hall of Fame jockey, so that's another Butte guy. And then the third one, with another connection, is a guy named Smokey Saunders, who you'll also have to look up, who grew up in Bozeman. Then his family moved up to Canada for a while, and then when he got to be an adult, he came back to Montana and rode the circuit around here before going to California. And he ultimately rides a Triple Crown winner. And Marcus Daly, just speaking of the Triple Crown, because Preakness is this weekend, folks, and then the Belmont and first weekend of June. Marcus Daly's horse, Scottish Chieftain, won the 1897 Belmont Stakes. So that was one of Montana's claims to fame. So I will quit geeking out about horses now and turn it back to you, Sarah.
All right, well, thank you so much. Well, thank you, Brenda, that was wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for coming out today. As mentioned earlier, we do have books here on the side sold by Cassiopeia if you wanted to purchase any of Brenda's works. And then we have swag and things on the back table if you want any GFPL stuff. There's also some reviews of today's program if anybody wants to fill out any of that just to tell us what you thought about it today. And as mentioned earlier, thank you, Brenda, we do have the Montana Constitution Roadshow coming on Thursday. We're going to have that presentation right here in this room. It's going to be really fantastic. What is that? That's not even a word. Fantastic. And actually, last time I was part of the talk, they talked about the apex theory as well. So that was really, right, that was the name of it? With the mines, yeah. Yeah, so that was really interesting to learn about that and then to hear it again here. So lots of cool things happening. And then on your seats, you have bookmarks for the Founding Futures program. We were chosen to partner with Visit Philadelphia for America 250. And they are going to be doing a whole day of programming on June 13th, which is a Saturday. And so we are going to be broadcasting their TED Talks here at the library starting at 9 a.m. So there's 2 different sessions that we're going to be able to broadcast here. So come in at 9. I think it's like 9 to 10:30, and then the next one is 12:30 to 2 or something like that. Well, there'll be a break, we'll have snacks, or you can leave and come back, your choice. Anyways, lots going on here at the library, lots of excitement. Can't wait to have you guys back. Thank you for coming, and we'll see you next time.